Princess Alara pressed her back against the cold marble wall of the throne hall, her emerald dress torn at the sleeves, her golden crown askew on her disheveled hair. The afternoon sun streamed through the towering stained-glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the polished floor where she stood trembling. Her father, King Aldrich, towered over her with fury blazing in his steel-gray eyes, his massive hand still raised from where he had just struck her across the face. "You will marry Duke Roderick tomorrow, and that is final," the king roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling adorned with paintings of their ancestors. "I will not have you disgrace this family any longer with your foolish romantic notions." Alara's cheek burned from the blow, but the pain in her heart cut deeper than any physical wound. She had known this day would come, had dreaded it since her 18th birthday 6 months ago when the marriage negotiations began. Duke Roderick was a cruel man, twice her age, with cold dead eyes, and hands that wandered where they should not. The very thought of becoming his wife made her stomach churn with revulsion. "Father, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the vast hall. "I cannot marry him. You know what kind of man he is." The servants whisper about how he treated his first wife, how she died under mysterious circumstances just 2 years into their marriage. King Aldrich's face darkened further at her words. He had built his reign on strategic alliances and political marriages, viewing his daughter as nothing more than a valuable piece on the chessboard of kingdom politics. Duke Roderick controlled the largest army outside of the royal forces and commanded the loyalty of 3 neighboring provinces. This marriage would secure the kingdom's borders and strengthen Aldrich's grip on power. "Those are nothing but servants' gossip and wild rumors," the king spat, though they both knew the whispers held more truth than he cared to admit. "Duke Roderick is a powerful ally, and you will do your duty to this crown and this kingdom. Your personal feelings are irrelevant." Alara felt tears threatening to spill down her cheeks, but she refused to show such weakness before her father. Throughout her childhood, he had been distant and cold, more concerned with grooming her to be a perfect political tool than nurturing her as his daughter. Her mother, Queen Isabella, had died when Alara was only 12, taking with her the only source of warmth and love the princess had ever known. "What about love?" Alara asked desperately, knowing it was futile but unable to stop herself. "Mother always told me that true love was the greatest treasure in any kingdom. She said that when I found it, I would know it immediately, like a flame lighting up the darkness." The king's expression grew even more thunderous at the mention of his late wife. Queen Isabella had been a romantic dreamer, filling their daughter's head with fairy tales and notions of love conquering all. In Aldrich's practical mind, such ideas were not only useless but dangerous, especially for a princess whose very existence served the political needs of the realm. "Your mother's romantic foolishness is what led to her death," he said cruelly, knowing exactly how much his words would wound his daughter. "She weakened herself with sentiment and emotion, and look where it got her. I will not watch you make the same mistakes." Alara gasped as if she had been slapped again. Her mother had died from a fever that swept through the kingdom, taking hundreds of lives regardless of their station. To blame her death on love and kindness was not only unfair, but deliberately hurtful. She could see in her father's eyes that he knew exactly what he was doing, using her deepest pain as a weapon against her. "That's not true, and you know it," she said, finding her voice and her courage despite her fear. "Mother died because she spent her final weeks caring for the sick in the lower city, bringing them medicine and comfort. She died because she loved her people, not because love made her weak." The king took a menacing step closer, his shadow falling across his daughter like a dark cloud. At 52 years old, Aldrich was still a formidable man, his broad shoulders and muscled frame maintained through years of swordplay and military training. His black hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled back in a severe style that emphasized the harsh angles of his weathered face. "Enough!" he bellowed, his voice carrying such force that several birds nesting in the eaves outside took flight in alarm. "You will marry Duke Roderick, you will bear his children, and you will strengthen this kingdom through your sacrifice. This is your destiny, your duty, and your fate. I will hear no more arguments on the matter." Alara straightened her spine, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. For 18 years, she had been the obedient daughter, the perfect princess, always doing what was expected of her. She had studied languages and diplomacy, learned to dance and play the harp, mastered the art of court etiquette and political conversation. She had smiled at boring nobles, made polite conversation with visiting dignitaries, and never once complained about her gilded cage. But this was different. This was her life, her body, her future happiness being bartered away like a prize merit market. The thought of Duke Roderick's cold hands on her skin, of bearing children who would inherit his cruelty, of spending decades trapped in a loveless marriage filled her with a desperation that overrode her fear. "I refuse," she said quietly, but with unmistakable determination. "I will not marry him." The silence that followed her defiance was deafening. King Aldrich stared at his daughter as if she had grown a second head, unable to comprehend that his perfectly trained princess had dared to defy him. For a moment, time seemed suspended in the throne hall, with dust motes dancing in the colored light, and the distant sounds of the castle continuing their daily rhythm beyond the thick walls. Then, the king's face contorted with a rage unlike anything Alara had ever seen. His hand shot out and grabbed her wrist with such force that she cried out in pain, his fingers digging into her delicate skin hard enough to leave marks that would last for days. "You forget yourself, girl," he hissed, his face now inches from hers. "You are my daughter, my property, my responsibility. I brought you into this world, and I can just as easily remove you from it." The dungeon cells beneath this castle have held more than one rebellious royal who forgot their place. Alara's eyes widened with genuine fear now. She had heard whispers of her father's younger brother, Prince Marcus, who had opposed one of Aldrich's political decisions years ago and had mysteriously disappeared shortly thereafter. The official story claimed he had died in a hunting accident, but the servants sometimes spoke in hushed tones about strange sounds coming from the deepest dungeons on certain dark nights. "You wouldn't," she breathed, though she could see in his cold eyes that he absolutely would. Power was everything to King Aldrich, and he would eliminate any threat to his authority, even if it came from his own flesh and blood. "Try me," he said softly, his voice now deadly calm in a way that was somehow more terrifying than his shouting had been. "I have spent 18 years investing in your education and upbringing, molding you into the perfect political asset. I will not allow you to throw away that investment because of childish romantic fantasies." He twisted her wrist cruelly, and Alara couldn't suppress a small cry of pain that escaped her lips. The sound echoed through the throne hall, carrying clearly to the massive oak doors that led to the corridor beyond. Neither the king nor the princess noticed the shadow that fell across the gap beneath those doors, or the way it lingered there, as if someone was listening intently to their conversation. "The wedding will proceed as planned tomorrow at noon," King Aldrich continued, his grip on her wrist tightening with each word. "You will walk down that aisle, you will speak the vows, and you will smile as if it is the happiest day of your life. Any deviation from this plan, any sign of resistance or reluctance, will result in consequences you cannot imagine." Tears finally began to stream down Alara's face as the full hopelessness of her situation crashed over her like a wave. She was trapped, completely and utterly trapped, with no allies, no escape route, and no hope of rescue. Her father controlled everything and everyone within the castle walls. The nobles were either afraid of him or benefited from his favor. The servants knew better than to involve themselves in royal family disputes. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking with desperation. "I'm begging you. Find another way to secure your alliance with Duke Roderick. Offer him land, or gold, or trade agreements. Don't sacrifice your own daughter to a man who will treat her like livestock." For just a moment, something flickered in the king's eyes. Perhaps it was a memory of the bright, cheerful little girl Alara had been before the weight of royal duty had crushed her spirit. Perhaps it was an echo of the love he had once felt for his wife, reflected now in their daughter's pleading green eyes. But whatever softness might have existed was quickly smothered by the iron will and political calculation that had driven his every decision for decades. "Sentiment is weakness," he said, releasing her wrist so suddenly that she stumbled backward. "And weakness is death for kings. I learned that lesson long ago, and now you must learn it too. You are not my daughter in this moment. You are a princess of this realm, and you will do what princesses do. You will serve the greater good, no matter the cost to yourself." Alara rubbed her throbbing wrist. already seeing the dark bruises forming where his fingers had gripped her. She felt something dying inside her chest, some last vestige of hope or faith in the goodness of the world. If her own father could treat her with such callous cruelty, what hope did she have that anyone would ever truly care for her? Duke Roderick will be here within the hour for the final ceremony preparations. The king continued, straightening his ceremonial robes and adjusting his crown as if their confrontation had been nothing more than a minor business meeting. You will greet him with proper courtesy and enthusiasm. You will convince him that you are eager for tomorrow's wedding. Any hint that you harbor reservations about this marriage will be dealt with swiftly and permanently. He turned toward his throne, a massive chair carved from black oak and inlaid with gold and precious gems. It had been in his family for 12 generations, and every king who had sat upon it had understood the fundamental truth that power required sacrifice. Personal happiness, individual desires, even family bonds, all of these were secondary to the needs of the crown. Your guard escort will accompany you to your chambers now, he said without looking back at her. You are confined there until tomorrow's ceremony. I suggest you use the time to prepare yourself mentally for your new role as a duchess. Perhaps you should also pray for the wisdom to accept what cannot be changed. Alara felt her legs trembling beneath her as the full weight of her situation settled upon her shoulders. She was to be a prisoner in her own home until her wedding day, watched and guarded to ensure she could not attempt escape. Tomorrow, she would be handed over to Duke Roderick like a piece of property, expected to submit to his will for the rest of her life. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her completely, a small flame of defiance still flickered in her heart. Her mother had taught her that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was refuse to accept an unacceptable fate, even when the odds seemed impossible. Queen Isabella had stood up to corrupt nobles, defended innocent servants, and fought for justice even when it put her at odds with powerful enemies. I won't give up, Alara whispered to herself, so quietly that even she could barely hear the words. Somehow, someway, I'll find a path out of this darkness. The throne hall doors opened with a groan of heavy hinges, and Captain Henrik of the Royal Guard stepped inside. He was a man in his 40s with graying brown hair and kind eyes that had always reminded Alara of her mother's favorite stablemaster. Unlike many of the castle's inhabitants, Henrik had never seemed intimidated by the king's harsh demeanor, and he had always treated the princess with genuine respect rather than mere courtesy. Your Majesty, Henrik said with a bow, though his eyes immediately went to Alara's tear-stained face and bruised wrist. You summoned me to escort Princess Alara to her chambers? Indeed, the king replied curtly. She is to remain there until tomorrow's wedding ceremony. No visitors, no messages in or out. She needs time for quiet reflection before taking on the responsibilities of married life. Henrik's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he took in the true meaning behind the king's words. He had served the royal family for over 20 years, had watched little Alara grow from a laughing child into a thoughtful young woman. The idea of her being forced into marriage against her will clearly troubled him, though he was far too disciplined to voice such concerns openly. Of course, Your Majesty, he said formally. Princess, if you would please come with me. Alara looked one last time at her father, hoping against hope that he might change his mind, might remember that he loved her more than his political ambitions. But King Aldrich had already turned away, studying a map of the kingdom spread across a table near his throne. She was dismissed, forgotten, her fate sealed with the casual indifference one might show when deciding what to have for supper. As she walked toward the doors on unsteady legs, Alara caught Captain Henrik's eye. There was something in his expression, a subtle intensity that seemed to convey a message she couldn't quite understand. It was as if he was trying to tell her something without words, some piece of information that he couldn't risk speaking aloud in the king's presence. The doors closed behind them with a hollow boom that seemed to echo in Alara's chest like the sound of a tomb being sealed. The corridor beyond was empty except for two younger guards who fell in a step behind them as they made their way through the castle's winding passages. The late afternoon light slanted through narrow windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for the princess like grasping fingers. As they walked in silence, Alara's mind raced despite her emotional exhaustion. There had to be something she could do, some way to escape this fate that felt worse than death itself. But what options did she have? The castle was surrounded by high walls and loyal guards. The kingdom beyond was filled with her father's subjects, who would return a runaway princess for the reward money. Even if she managed to reach the neighboring kingdoms, they would likely send her back to avoid diplomatic complications with King Aldrich. But, as they reached the base of the tower stairs that led to her chambers, Captain Henrik spoke quietly, his words meant only for her ears. "Sometimes, Your Highness, the darkest hour comes just before dawn. Have faith that morning will come again." Before Alara could respond or ask what he meant, he had stepped back and was gesturing for her to climb the stairs. But his words planted a tiny seed of hope in her heart, a possibility that perhaps she wasn't as alone as she had believed. Maybe, just maybe, there were others in the castle who understood the injustice of her situation and might be willing to help. As she climbed the spiral staircase toward her chamber, each step echoing in the narrow stone passage, Princess Alara began to plan. Tomorrow might be her wedding day, but it didn't have to be the day her spirit died. If there was any way to escape, any chance for freedom, she would find it. The question was whether she would have enough time, and whether the mysterious hope in Captain Henrik's eyes was based on something real, or merely the kind words of a compassionate man who wished he could help but was ultimately powerless to change anything. Either way, Alara knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would not go quietly into the cage her father had prepared for her. If Duke Roderick wanted a bride, he would have to claim one who fought every step of the way. The stone walls of Princess Alara's chamber felt colder than usual as she paced back and forth across the Persian rug that covered most of the floor. 3 hours had passed since Captain Henrik had escorted her to this tower prison, and the sun was beginning to set beyond her windows, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her painfully of better times when she could watch sunsets without the weight of impending doom crushing her spirit. She tried everything she could think of to find an escape route. The windows were too high and too narrow, with a sheer drop of 60 feet to the courtyard below. The door was locked from the outside, and she could hear the quiet conversations of the guards stationed in the corridor beyond. Even if she could somehow overpower them, which seemed impossible given their training and weapons, where would she go? The castle was a maze of passages that she knew well, but every exit was guarded, every gate monitored. A soft knock at her door made her freeze in the middle of her pacing. It was too early for dinner, and she hadn't expected any visitors. Her father had made it clear that she was to be completely isolated until tomorrow's ceremony. "Your Highness?" came a familiar voice that made her heart skip with surprise. It was Sarah, her lady's maid, a woman in her 30s who had served in the castle since she was 16. Sarah had always been kind to Alara, treating her more like a younger sister than a royal mistress. But she was also fiercely loyal to the crown and had never shown any inclination to involve herself in palace politics. "Sarah," Alara called out, moving closer to the heavy oak door. "What are you doing here? I thought Father had ordered that I not receive any visitors." There was a pause, followed by the sound of a key turning in the lock. The door opened just wide enough for Sarah to slip inside, and Alara noticed immediately that the maid's usual calm demeanor was replaced by nervous energy. Her brown hair was coming loose from its neat bun, and her hands shook slightly as she locked the door behind her. "I told the guards I needed to bring you fresh linens for tomorrow," Sarah whispered, glancing around the room as if she expected to find enemy spies hiding in the corners. "But that's not really why I'm here." Alara felt her pulse quicken with sudden hope. "What do you mean? Sarah, what's going on?" The maid moved to the center of the room and gestured for Alara to come closer. When they were standing near the fireplace, far from the door and windows where their conversation might be overheard, Sarah reached into the pocket of her gray dress and withdrew a small piece of parchment folded several times. "This came for you an hour ago," she said quietly. "It was delivered by a young man I didn't recognize, someone from outside the castle. He insisted it was urgent and asked me to make sure you received it personally." Alara's hands trembled as she took the note. Very few people outside the royal family could read and write, which meant this message likely came from someone of education and means. Her first thought was that perhaps one of the neighboring kingdoms had heard about her situation and was offering assistance, though she couldn't imagine why they would risk King Aldrich's wrath to help her. She unfolded the parchment carefully, revealing elegant handwriting in dark blue ink. The message was brief, but made her heart race with a combination of hope and terror. "Your Highness, if you truly wish to escape tomorrow's wedding, Be ready when the cathedral bells ring midnight. Trust the guard who wears a white rose in his collar. Your devoted servant, a friend in the shadows. Alara read the message 3 times, trying to process what it meant. Someone was planning to help her escape, but who? And how could they possibly succeed where she had failed to even imagine a workable plan? Sarah, she whispered urgently, do you know anything about this? Have you seen any guards wearing white roses? The maid shook her head, but there was something in her expression that made Alara suspect she knew more than she was saying. I can't say I've noticed, Your Highness. But then again, I've been so busy with preparations for tomorrow that I might have missed such details. Before Alara could ask more questions, the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor outside made both women freeze. Sarah quickly took the note from Alara's hands and tossed it into the fireplace, where the flames consumed it within seconds. Remember, the maid whispered as the footsteps grew closer, fresh linens. That's all we discussed. The door burst open without ceremony, and Duke Roderick strode into the chamber with the casual confidence of a man who already considered it his domain. He was a large man, standing well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the kind of muscled frame that came from years of military training. His dark hair was beginning to thin at the crown, and his face bore several scars from old battles that gave him a permanently menacing appearance. Behind him came King Aldrich, followed by 2 of the Duke's personal guards who positioned themselves near the doorway. Alara noticed that both of these men had the cold, empty eyes of soldiers who would follow orders without question, no matter how distasteful those orders might be. Ah, my lovely bride-to-be, Duke Roderick said with a smile that never reached his eyes. I trust you are preparing yourself properly for our wedding tomorrow. Alara forced herself to curtsy politely, knowing that any sign of defiance would only make her situation worse. Your Grace, she murmured, keeping her eyes downcast so he couldn't see the revulsion and fear in them. Sarah, you are dismissed, King Aldrich said curtly. The Duke wishes to speak privately with his betrothed. The maid curtsied and hurried from the room, but not before catching Alara's eye one more time. There was something meaningful in that look, though Alara couldn't quite interpret what Sarah was trying to communicate. Once the door closed behind the maid, Duke Roderick began walking slowly around Alara's chamber, examining her possessions with the air of a man taking inventory of his new property. He picked up a silver brush from her dressing table, turned over a few books on her reading shelf, and paused to admire a painting of her mother that hung near the window. Queen Isabella was indeed a beautiful woman, he mused, though there was something unsettling in his tone. I can see where you inherited your looks, my dear. I trust you also inherited her other qualities. Alara felt her skin crawl at the implication in his words, but she forced herself to remain silent and motionless. Her father watched from near the fireplace, his arms crossed, and his expression unreadable. She wondered if he had any idea what kind of man he was handing her over to, or if he simply didn't care as long as the political alliance was secured. I've been thinking about our future together, Duke Roderick continued, moving to stand directly in front of her. My lands are vast, but somewhat isolated from the main kingdom. You will find life there quite different from the luxuries of castle life. More rustic, shall we say. I'm sure I will adapt to whatever circumstances our marriage brings, Alara said carefully, though every word felt like swallowing poison. The Duke reached out and tilted her chin up with one finger, forcing her to meet his gaze. His eyes were a pale gray color that reminded her unpleasantly of winter storms, and she could smell wine on his breath despite the early hour. You have spirit, he said approvingly. I like that in a woman up to a point. It makes the eventual training more interesting. King Aldrich cleared his throat uncomfortably, perhaps finally beginning to realize exactly what kind of arrangement he had made for his daughter. Duke Roderick, perhaps we should discuss the final details of tomorrow's ceremony. I believe the cathedral arrangements require your approval. But the Duke seemed in no hurry to leave. He moved even closer to Alara, close enough that she could feel his breath on her face and see the predatory gleam in his cold eyes. Tell me, Princess, he said softly, are you still a maiden? I would hate to discover after our wedding that my bride had been compromised by some foolish romantic entanglement. Alara's face burned with humiliation and anger, but she managed to keep her voice steady. I've always conducted myself with a propriety befitting a princess of this realm. Good, he said with satisfaction. I have little patience for women who have given their virtue to unworthy men. In my experience, such females require considerable correction before they can properly serve their husbands. The way he said the word correction made Alara's blood run cold. She had heard whispers about his first wife, Lady Catherine, who had supposedly died in a fall down the stairs of his castle. But some of the older servants claimed she had been covered in bruises when her body was found, bruises that suggested violence rather than an accidental tumble. I think we should return to discussing the ceremony. King Aldrich interjected again, and this time there was a note of genuine unease in his voice. Perhaps even his political calculations had limits when it came to his daughter's safety. Duke Roderick stepped back slightly, but his gaze never left Alara's face. Of course, but first I have a small gift for my bride. He gestured to one of his guards, who stepped forward and handed him a small wooden box. The Duke opened it to reveal a necklace made of black pearls interspersed with dark sapphires. It was undeniably beautiful, but there was something sinister about its appearance, as if it had been designed more as a collar than an ornament. "This belonged to my first wife," he explained as he lifted the necklace from its box. "She wore it every day of our marriage. I thought it fitting that my new bride should continue the tradition." Alara wanted to recoil from the jewelry, wanted to refuse this macabre gift that felt more like a symbol of ownership than affection. But she could see her father's warning look and knew that any resistance would be met with swift punishment. "It's beautiful," she managed to say, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "Allow me," Duke Roderick said, moving behind her to fasten the necklace around her throat. The pearls were cold against her skin, and the weight of them felt oppressive, as if they were already beginning to drag her down into the life of misery that awaited her. As he worked with the clasp, his hands lingered longer than necessary on her neck and shoulders, his touch possessive and inappropriate. Alara closed her eyes and tried to transport herself mentally to happier times, to memories of riding through the forest with her mother or reading stories by the fireplace on winter evenings. "Perfect," the Duke murmured when the necklace was secured. "You look every inch the Duchess already." When Alara opened her eyes, she caught sight of herself in the mirror across the room. The black pearls made her look pale and fragile, like a flower that had been plucked too early and was already beginning to wilt. The necklace seemed to transform her from a vibrant young woman into something subdued and defeated. "Now then," King Aldrich said with forced cheerfulness, "shall we review the final arrangements? The ceremony begins at noon tomorrow, with the reception to follow in the Great Hall. Duke Roderick, your family, and retainers are already being accommodated in the guest wings." As the two men launched into a discussion of seating arrangements and menu selections, Alara found herself thinking about the mysterious note that had been burned in her fireplace. Someone was planning to help her escape at midnight, but that was still several hours away. Could she endure that much more time pretending to be a willing participant in her own destruction? The conversation seemed to drag on forever, with Duke Roderick making increasingly possessive comments about his upcoming bride, and King Aldrich responding with the enthusiasm of a merchant who had just negotiated a particularly profitable trade agreement. Neither man seemed to notice or care that the subject of their discussion was standing right there, listening to them plan out her future as if she were a piece of furniture being arranged in a room. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the Duke announced that he should return to his chambers to prepare for tomorrow's early festivities. "I want to be well rested for my wedding night," he said with a leer that made Alara's stomach churn. "Of course," King Aldrich agreed. "Alara, bid farewell to your betrothed." She forced herself to curtsy again, trying to ignore the way Duke Roderick's eyes traveled over her body with obvious hunger. "Good evening, Your Grace. I look forward to tomorrow." The lie came easier than she had expected, perhaps because she had been practicing deception her entire life in the form of court etiquette and diplomatic courtesy. Every princess learned early how to say things she didn't mean with perfect sincerity. "As do I, my dear," the Duke replied, taking her hand and raising it to his lips for a kiss that lingered far too long. "Sweet dreams. I hope you rest well, because you will have little opportunity for sleep in the days to come." After the men departed, leaving her alone once again in her chamber, Alara collapsed into the chair by her fireplace and, finally, allowed herself to cry. The tears came in great heaving sobs that shook her entire body, releasing some of the pressure that had been building inside her chest all day. She touched the black pearl necklace around her throat and felt like she was already wearing shackles. Tomorrow, she would walk down the cathedral aisle in a white dress that would feel like a burial shroud. She would speak vows that would bind her to a man who frightened and repulsed her. She would become Duchess Alara, a title that sounded like a death sentence. But as the tears finally subsided and her breathing returned to normal, she remembered the note's promise. Someone was planning to help her escape. Someone who signed themselves as a friend in the shadows. The phrase suggested someone who operated in secret, perhaps a member of the castle staff, or even one of the guards who had grown disgusted with the king's treatment of his daughter. The cathedral bells would ring midnight in just over 4 hours. Until then, she would have to continue her performance as the dutiful bride-to-be. But when those bells chimed, she would be ready. Whatever plan this mysterious ally had devised, whatever risks it involved, it had to be better than the alternative fate that awaited her at noon tomorrow. Alara moved to her window and looked out at the darkening kingdom below. Somewhere out, there was a life of freedom, a possibility of happiness, a chance to choose her own destiny. All she had to do was find the courage to reach for it when the moment came. The black pearls seemed to grow heavier around her throat as the evening shadows lengthened across her chamber. But for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Princess Alara felt a spark of genuine hope flickering in her heart. Freedom might still be possible if she was brave enough to seize it. The cathedral bells began their midnight song as Princess Alara stood by her chamber window, fully dressed in her darkest traveling cloak with her few precious belongings tucked into a small leather satchel. Her heart hammered against her ribs as each bronze note echoed across the sleeping castle, marking the moment when her life would either change forever or end in disaster. She had spent the last 4 hours in careful preparation, packing only what she could carry easily and planning what she would say if questioned. The black pearl necklace lay coiled on her dressing table like a serpent, abandoned along with the life of captivity it represented. She had considered taking it for its monetary value, but the thought of wearing Duke Roderick's dead wife's jewelry made her skin crawl with revulsion. As the final bell note faded into silence, Alara heard a soft scratching sound at her door, barely audible above the whisper of wind through her window frames. It was not the confident knock of an official visitor, but rather the cautious signal of someone who wished to remain undetected. She moved to the door and pressed her ear against the heavy wood, listening intently. 2 sets of footsteps were moving in the corridor outside, but they seemed to be walking away from her chamber rather than approaching. After a few moments of tense silence, she heard 3 soft taps, followed by a pause, then 2 more taps. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, Alara quietly called out, "Who goes there?" "A friend who brings white roses," came the whispered reply from the other side of the door. Her pulse quickened with excitement and fear as she recognized the coded response from the mysterious note. Someone had actually come to help her, despite the enormous risk such action represented. If they were caught, the punishment would surely be death for treason against the crown. The sound of a key turning in the lock made her step back from the door. It opened just wide enough for a figure to slip inside before closing again immediately. In the dim light from her fireplace, she could make out the familiar uniform of a castle guard, but the man wearing it was not someone she recognized immediately. He was younger than most of the senior guards, perhaps in his late 20s, with sandy brown hair and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in every detail of her chamber at once. Most importantly, she could see a small white rose tucked into the collar of his uniform, exactly as the note had promised. "Your Highness," he said in a low voice, offering a respectful bow, "I am Thomas Blackwood, and I have come to offer you an escape from tomorrow's wedding, if you truly desire it." "Thomas Blackwood," she repeated softly, trying to place the name. "Are you new to the castle guard? I don't recall seeing you before." A slight smile crossed his face, transforming his serious expression into something warmer and more approachable. "I have been here for 3 months, Your Highness, but I work primarily the night shifts in the outer towers. Most of the court never sees guards like me. We are the invisible ones who watch the walls while nobles sleep safely in their beds." There was something in his tone that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with the rigid class distinctions that govern castle life. Unlike many guards who seemed to relish their small amount of authority over servants and commoners, Thomas spoke as if he understood what it felt like to be powerless in the face of larger forces. "Why are you helping me?" Alara asked, studying his face carefully. "You must know the risk you're taking. If we're caught, my father will have you executed for treason." Thomas moved closer to the window, motioning for her to join him so they could speak more quietly. In the moonlight streaming through the glass, She could see that he had kind eyes and a face that suggested intelligence and compassion rather than the brutal efficiency valued in most royal guards. "Because no one should be forced into a marriage against their will," he said simply, "and because I know what Duke Roderick is really like. I served briefly in his household guard 3 years ago before coming here. I saw how he treated his first wife, and I know the truth about how she died." Alara's breath caught in her throat. What truth? What really happened to Lady Catherine? Thomas's expression darkened with remembered anger. She tried to leave him after 2 years of abuse. Duke Roderick caught her attempting to escape, and let us say her fall down the stairs was not accidental. I was the guard who found her body, and I saw the finger-shaped bruises on her throat. The confirmation of her worst fears about her intended husband sent a chill through Alara's entire body. She had suspected Duke Roderick was capable of violence, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly made her realize just how desperate her situation truly was. "Why didn't you report what you saw?" she asked. "To whom?" Thomas replied bitterly. Duke Roderick commanded absolute loyalty from his men through fear. Those who crossed him disappeared. Those who served him faithfully were rewarded. I was young and frightened, and I value my life more than justice. But I have regretted that cowardice every day since. She could hear the genuine remorse in his voice and understood that helping her escape was, in part, his attempt to atone for his previous failure to protect an innocent woman. It made her trust him more than any elaborate credentials could have done. "How do you propose we escape?" she asked, moving to collect her satchel and cloak. "The castle is heavily guarded, and my father has made it clear that I am to be watched constantly." Thomas smiled again, and this time there was a hint of mischief in his expression that made him look younger and more approachable. "Your father made one crucial mistake in his planning, Your Highness. He assumed that all the guards would remain loyal to him above all other considerations. But there are more men in this castle than you might think who are troubled by forcing a princess into an unwilling marriage." "You mean others are involved in this plan?" "3 others," he confirmed. "Men who have served your family faithfully for years, but who cannot stand by and watch injustice be done in the name of political expediency. Captain Henrik has been particularly helpful in arranging tonight's operation." Alara felt a surge of gratitude toward the older guard who had shown her such kindness earlier. She had sensed something meaningful in his words about dawn coming after the darkest hour, and now she understood that he had been trying to give her hope without revealing the rescue plan that was already in motion. "What about the guards outside my door?" she asked. "How do we get past them?" "They have been given wine, laced with a sleeping draught," Thomas explained. "Nothing harmful, just something to ensure they sleep deeply for the next several hours. By the time they wake, we will be far from here, and they will be able to claim honestly that they saw and heard nothing suspicious." The plan was more sophisticated than she had dared to hope. Thomas and his allies had clearly thought through many of the obstacles that would face an escaping princess and her accomplices. But she still couldn't see how they would get beyond the castle walls without being detected by the other guards who would not be affected by sleeping draughts. As if reading her thoughts, Thomas moved to her window and gestured for her to look outside. "Do you see the old oak tree whose branches reach almost to your window? The one your mother used to say looked like it was reaching up to embrace the tower." Alara looked where he pointed and saw the massive tree she remembered from her childhood. Queen Isabella had indeed made that exact observation many times during their evening walks in the garden below. The tree had grown larger over the years, and its uppermost branches now extended quite close to her chamber window. "You want me to climb down a tree?" she asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of her voice. "I haven't done anything like that since I was a child playing in the castle gardens." "It's not as dangerous as it appears," Thomas assured her. "The branches are strong, and I will go first to test each step and guide you. Once we reach the ground, we will make our way to the stables where horses are waiting. And then we ride hard for the border. I have contacts in the neighboring kingdom of Astoria who can provide sanctuary while we determine what options exist for your future." The plan was bold and dangerous, but it offered something that staying in the castle could never provide: hope. Even if they were caught and executed, at least she would have tried to claim her own destiny rather than submitting passively to a fate worse than death. "I need you to understand something," Thomas said seriously, his voice dropping even lower. "Once we begin this escape, there will be no turning back. Your father will consider you dead to him, and Duke Roderick will never forgive the insult. You will be giving up your title, your inheritance, your position in society. You will be trading a life of privilege for one of uncertainty and potential hardship. Alara touched the place on her throat where the black pearl necklace had rested just hours earlier, remembering the weight of those symbols of captivity. A golden cage is still a cage, she said firmly. I would rather live as a free woman with nothing than die slowly as a duchess with everything. Thomas nodded approvingly at her response. Then, let's waste no more time. Every minute we delay increases the chance of discovery. He moved to the window and carefully examined the latch and hinges, testing to ensure they would open quietly. The window was tall and narrow, designed more for light and air than for easy passage, but it was wide enough for a determined person to squeeze through. I will go first, he explained as he worked with a window mechanism. Once I am on the largest branch, I will signal that it is safe for you to follow. Move slowly and carefully, and remember that the branches are stronger than they appear. The window opened with only a whisper of sound, letting in the cool night air that carried the scent of the gardens below and the distant forest beyond. Thomas sat on the windowsill and carefully maneuvered himself onto the nearest branch, testing its strength before committing his full weight to it. Watching him navigate the tree with confident ease, Alara realized that this escape had been planned for more than just a few hours. Thomas moved with the familiarity of someone who had practiced this exact route multiple times. The thought that someone had been working for days, or even weeks to arrange a rescue, filled her with a gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Within a few minutes, Thomas had positioned himself on a thick branch about 10 feet below her window. He looked up and gestured for her to begin her descent, ready to guide and catch her if she slipped. Taking a deep breath and offering a silent prayer to her mother's spirit for protection, Alara gathered her skirts and climbed carefully onto her window ledge. The stone was cold beneath her hands, and the drop to the garden below seemed impossibly far. For a moment, fear almost overwhelmed her determination. But then she thought about Duke Roderick's cold gray eyes and possessive hands, about the black pearl necklace that felt like a collar, about the life of misery and abuse that awaited her if she remained in the castle. Fear of falling seemed minor compared to fear of the future her father had planned for her. She reached out for the nearest branch, grateful for the practical leather gloves Thomas had thought to bring for her. The bark was rough beneath her fingers, but the branch felt solid and reassuring as she tested its strength. That's it, Thomas encouraged quietly from below. Take your time. Test each hold before trusting it completely. The descent was slower and more difficult than she had anticipated. The elegant court shoes she wore were not designed for tree climbing, and her long skirts kept tangling around her legs. But Thomas continued to offer quiet guidance and encouragement, and gradually she made progress toward the larger branch where he waited. When she was still about 6 feet above him, her foot slipped on a patch of moss-covered bark. For a terrifying moment, she hung by her hands alone, her legs swinging freely in the air as she struggled to find purchase against the tree trunk. I've got you, Thomas said, immediately climbing toward her and positioning himself to provide support. Put your left foot on my shoulder and steady yourself. His quick thinking and steady strength allowed her to regain her footing and continue the descent safely. When she finally reached the branch where he waited, she was breathless and shaking, but exhilarated by her success. The hardest part is over, Thomas assured her as they both caught their breath. From here, we can make our way down much more easily. They descended the rest of the way without incident, though Alara's legs felt unsteady when her feet finally touched the solid ground of the garden. She had climbed out of more than just a tower window. She had climbed out of one life and into an uncertain but hopeful future. This way, Thomas whispered, leading her along a path between the rose bushes that would keep them hidden from the guard stationed at the main entrances to the castle. Stay low and move quietly. We still have to reach the stables without being seen. As they made their careful way through the moonlit gardens where she had played as a child and walked with her mother during happier times, Alara felt a mixture of sadness and relief. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, but she was also leaving behind the pain and oppression that had defined her recent life. The future was uncertain and frightening, but it was her future to shape. For the first time in years, Princess Alara felt truly alive, her heart pounding with the thrill of claiming her own destiny rather than accepting the one others had chosen for her. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as a free woman rather than a captive princess. And that made all the risk and uncertainty worthwhile. The royal stables stood in shadow at the far edge of the castle grounds, their familiar smell of hay and horses bringing back memories of happier times when Alara had been allowed to ride freely through the countryside with only a single guard for escort. Now, as she and Thomas crept between the wooden stalls toward the sound of quietly nickering horses, those days of innocent freedom seemed like they belonged to someone else's life. Two figures emerged from the darkness near the tack room, and Alara's heart leaped with recognition. Captain Henrik stepped forward first, his weathered face creased with worry, but his eyes bright with determination. Behind him was Marcus, a young stable hand she remembered from her childhood riding lessons, now grown into a capable man in his early 20s with strong hands and an honest face. "Your Highness," Captain Henrik whispered, offering a respectful bow despite the urgency of their situation. "I am relieved to see you safely away from the tower. Are you hurt?" Thomas said the descent might be challenging. "I'm unharmed," Alara assured him, though her hands still trembled slightly from the combination of exertion and adrenaline. "Captain, I cannot thank you enough for your courage in helping me. You are risking everything for someone who may never be able to repay your kindness." The older guard's expression softened with something that reminded her powerfully of the way her mother's guards used to look at Queen Isabella with genuine affection and respect. "Your Highness, I have served this royal family for over 20 years. I watched you grow from a bright little girl into a thoughtful young woman of honor and compassion. No amount of political advantage is worth destroying someone of your character." Marcus stepped forward and gestured toward 3 horses that stood saddled and ready near the stable's rear entrance. "The mounts are prepared, Your Highness. I've chosen the strongest and fastest horses in the royal stable, with enough provisions for a hard ride to the border." Alara recognized her own mare, Moonbeam, a gentle gray horse with intelligent eyes and a willing spirit. Seeing her beloved mount again brought tears to her eyes as she realized how many precious things she was leaving behind in her desperate flight to freedom. "How long do we have before the alarm is raised?" Thomas asked as he checked the saddlebags and weapons secured to each horse. "The drug guard should sleep until dawn," Captain Henrik replied. "But there will be a change of watch at sunrise, and when the new guards find their predecessors unconscious, the search will begin immediately. You need to be at least 20 miles away by then, preferably across the border into Astoria." Marcus handed Alara a heavy woolen cloak lined with fur, designed for long travel in cold weather. "The nights are still chilly this time of year, Your Highness. This should keep you warm during the ride." As she fastened the cloak around her shoulders, Alara noticed that someone had sewn a small white rose onto the collar, matching the one Thomas wore. It was a simple gesture, but it moved her deeply to realize that these men had taken the time to create a symbol of their shared conspiracy against injustice. "What about you?" she asked Captain Henrik and Marcus. "When my father discovers I'm gone, he'll question everyone who had access to the castle tonight. Your lives will be in danger." "We have prepared for that possibility," Henrik assured her. "Marcus and I will claim that we noticed unusual activity near the stables and went to investigate, only to be knocked unconscious by unknown assailants. The evidence will support our story, and your father will have no choice but to believe it." Thomas mounted his horse, a sturdy black gelding that looked capable of maintaining a fast pace for many miles. "We should leave immediately. Every minute we delay increases the risk of discovery." Alara approached Moonbeam and stroked the mare's neck gently, whispering soft words of greeting. The horse whinnied quietly in response, as if sensing that this midnight ride would be different from their usual peaceful excursions through the castle grounds. As she prepared to mount, Marcus stepped close and spoke quietly. "Your Highness, I want you to know that there are many people in this castle who respect and care for you. If you ever need allies or assistance in the future, remember that you have friends here who will not forget your kindness to servants and common folk." His words reminded her of all the small gestures of compassion her mother had taught her to show toward those of lower station. Queen Isabella had always insisted that true nobility came from character rather than birth, and that a royal's duty was to protect and serve those who could not protect themselves. "Thank you, Marcus," she said warmly. "I will remember all of you with gratitude for the rest of my life." She mounted Moonbeam with Thomas's assistance, grateful that her childhood riding lessons had included instruction in riding astride rather than the side saddle position considered more proper for ladies. Tonight, speed and stability were far more important than court etiquette. Captain Henrik handed her a small purse heavy with gold coins. "This should provide for your immediate needs once you reach safety. It's not much compared to your usual wealth, but it will allow you to live independently for several months while you decide on your future path." The weight of the coins in her hand represented more than money. It represented the possibility of self-determination. For the first time in her life, she would be responsible for her own survival and success, without servants or advisors or family obligations to constrain her choices. "Are you certain about this path, Your Highness?" Thomas asked gently as they prepared to depart. "Once we ride through those gates, there will be no possibility of return. You will be choosing exile and uncertainty over security and privilege." Alara looked back toward the castle that had been her home for 18 years. In the moonlight, it looked like something from a fairy tale, all soaring towers and graceful battlements. But she knew that behind those beautiful walls lay a father who saw her as property to be traded, and a future husband who would treat her with casual cruelty. "I am certain," she said firmly. "Better to be a free woman with an uncertain future than a captive princess with a guaranteed misery." Thomas nodded approvingly at her resolve and guided his horse toward the stable's rear exit, which opened onto a seldom-used path leading through the castle's outer gardens toward the main road. Alara followed close behind, with Captain Henrik and Marcus walking alongside to ensure they reached the gates safely. The outer gardens were eerily quiet, with only the sound of their horses' hooves on the gravel path, and the distant call of night birds disturbing the silence. Alara found herself cataloging details she wanted to remember. The way the moonlight turned the fountain into a cascade of silver, the sweet scent of the jasmine that climbed the garden walls, the familiar outline of the library tower where she had spent so many peaceful hours reading. They reached the castle's outer gate without encountering any guards, though Alara could see the distant glow of torches at other checkpoints around the perimeter. The massive iron portcullis stood open, as it always did during peacetime, to allow for emergency arrivals or departures. "This is where we part," Captain Henrik said quietly. "From here, you must ride alone with Thomas, Marcus, and I will return to our posts and begin preparing our alibis for tomorrow's investigation." Alara dismounted and embraced each of the men who had risked everything to help her escape. Words seemed inadequate to express her gratitude, but she hoped they could see in her eyes how much their courage meant to her. "May fortune smile upon your journey," Marcus said softly, "and may you find the happiness you deserve in your new life. Remember us kindly," Captain Henrik added, "and know that you will always have friends in this castle, no matter what the future brings." They remounted and rode through the gate, leaving the castle grounds behind as they entered the dark countryside beyond. The road stretched ahead of them like a ribbon of possibility, leading toward unknown adventures and challenges. For the first few miles, they rode in relative silence, both conscious of the need to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the castle before dawn. The night air was cool and fresh, carrying the scents of wildflowers and pine trees that reminded Alara of the freedom she had glimpsed during childhood rides with her mother. As they created a hill and saw the castle lights disappearing behind them, Thomas finally spoke. "How are you feeling, Your Highness? I know this must be overwhelming." "Terrified and exhilarated in equal measure," she admitted honestly. "I keep expecting to wake up and find this was all a dream. It seems impossible that I'm actually free of my father's control and Duke Roderick's threats." "The danger is not over yet," Thomas reminded her gently. "Your father will send pursuit once your escape is discovered. We need to reach the border before his fastest riders can catch up with us." They spurred their horses to a faster pace, racing through the night toward the promise of sanctuary in a foreign kingdom. Behind them, the castle that had been Alara's prison gradually faded into the distance, while ahead lay a future full of uncertainty, but also possibility. As they rode through the darkness, Alara felt a strange mixture of grief and relief. She was mourning the loss of everything familiar and secure, but she was also celebrating the birth of her independence. Whatever challenges awaited her in exile, she would face them as herself rather than as Duke Roderick's unwilling wife. The first pale hints of dawn were beginning to appear on the eastern horizon when they finally reached the border crossing into Astoria. The guards at the checkpoint were sleepy and uninterested in questioning two travelers riding hard in the early morning hours. "Business in Astoria?" one guard asked routinely as he examined their travel documents, which Thomas had somehow managed to obtain in advance. "Trade negotiations," Thomas replied smoothly. "My master is eager to reach the capital before the markets open." The guards stamped their papers without further questions and waved them through. As their horses' hooves crossed the invisible line separating one kingdom from another, Alara felt a tremendous weight lift from her shoulders. She was no longer Princess Alara of her father's kingdom. She was simply Alara, a young woman with her own choices to make and her own destiny to forge. The future was uncertain and probably difficult, but it belonged entirely to her. For the first time since her mother's death, she was truly free. The morning sun was climbing higher into the clear blue sky when the cathedral bells began their urgent clamoring across the kingdom, their bronze voices carrying news that would shake the very foundations of the royal court. Princess Alara was gone, vanished from her locked tower chamber like morning mist before the wind. The wedding that was to have sealed a crucial political alliance lay in ruins, and, with it, King Aldrich's carefully constructed plans for securing his kingdom's future. Duke Roderick stood in the empty chamber that should have held his bride, his face twisted with a rage that made even his own guards step back in fear. The open window told part of the story, but not the part that mattered most to him. Someone had helped the princess escape, someone with knowledge of the castle's routines and access to keys and horses. This was not the desperate flight of a frightened girl, but a carefully planned conspiracy that had made him look like a fool before all the assembled wedding guests. "Find them," he snarled at Captain Henrik, who had been summoned to explain how a princess could simply disappear from a guarded tower. "I don't care if you have to search every farm and village in the kingdom. I want that girl brought back, and I want the heads of whoever helped her." Henrik maintained his carefully neutral expression as he examined the chamber for clues he already knew would lead nowhere. The sleeping guards had awakened with genuine confusion and no memory of the night's events. The stable showed signs of forced entry that Marcus had artfully created to support their cover story. Every piece of evidence supported the narrative that unknown assailants had infiltrated the castle for reasons that remained mysterious. "Your Grace," Henrik said respectfully, "my men are already scouring the countryside." However, the princess had several hours' head start, and there are many routes she might have taken. If she reached the border before dawn, our authority to pursue ends at the boundary stones. King Aldrich entered the chamber like a thundercloud made flesh, his face dark with fury and humiliation. The greatest embarrassment was not losing his daughter, but losing face before Duke Roderick and the hundreds of noble guests who had come to witness the wedding. Political marriages were the currency of royal power, and a failed marriage negotiation suggested weakness that enemies would be quick to exploit. "This is impossible," the king declared, though the evidence of his daughter's escape was undeniable. "Alara is a sheltered princess with no knowledge of the outside world. She could never have planned such an elaborate escape without assistance from someone within these walls." Duke Roderick turned his cold gray eyes on the king, and for a moment there was something dangerous in his expression that reminded everyone present why he commanded such fear and respect among his enemies. "Your Majesty, you assured me that your daughter was prepared for this marriage. You gave your word that she would fulfill her obligations to our alliance. Yet here we stand in an empty room, with a ruined wedding and my reputation damaged before half the nobility of the kingdom." The threat implicit in his words was clear to everyone present. Duke Roderick's military strength rivaled that of the royal army, and his alliance was crucial for maintaining the kingdom's security against external enemies. If he chose to withdraw his support and alliance, it could leave King Aldrich vulnerable to attacks from neighboring kingdoms that had long coveted his lands and resources. "The alliance remains strong," King Aldrich said quickly, though sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning coolness. "My daughter is clearly not herself, perhaps affected by some form of mental distress or outside influence. When she is found and returned, the wedding will proceed as planned. Perhaps, Duke Roderick replied coldly, but my patience is not unlimited. I did not come here to be made a fool of by a rebellious child. If Princess Alara is not found within 1 week, I will consider our agreement void and seek other arrangements for securing my borders. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to consume everything King Aldrich had worked to build. Without Duke Roderick's military support, the kingdom would be forced to maintain a much larger standing army, draining the treasury and leaving fewer resources for the infrastructure and trade agreements that maintain prosperity. As the Duke stormed from the chamber with his retainers, King Aldrich turned his attention to Captain Henrik with desperation barely concealed behind his royal composure. You know this castle better than anyone. You know every guard, every servant, every person who had access to my daughter. Someone betrayed me, and I want them found. Henrik had prepared for this moment throughout the sleepless night, rehearsing his responses and ensuring his story would remain consistent under questioning. Your Majesty, I have already begun a thorough investigation. However, I believe we should consider the possibility that the conspiracy reached beyond our own people. Foreign agents seeking to destabilize our kingdom would have strong motivation to prevent this marriage. It was a masterful deflection that played into the king's existing paranoia about external enemies while directing suspicion away from the castle's own staff. King Aldrich had many enemies who would benefit from seeing his alliance with Duke Roderick collapse, and the idea of foreign infiltrators was more palatable than accepting betrayal from within his own household. Double the guard on all entrances, the king commanded. Question every servant, every stable hand, every person who was in the castle last night. Someone saw something. Someone knows something. I want answers, Henrik, and I want them quickly. As the investigation began in earnest, with guards questioning staff throughout the castle, Marcus continued his work in the stables with the careful demeanor of someone who had nothing to hide. When questioned about the previous night's events, he provided a simple story about discovering the forced stable door when he arrived for his morning duties, complete with genuine concern about the theft of 3 horses from the royal stock. The beauty of their cover story was its simplicity. No one could prove that Marcus or Henrik had been involved in the escape because their actions could be explained by duty and coincidence. The sleeping guards could honestly claim they had seen and heard nothing unusual, having been unconscious throughout the crucial hours. Meanwhile, miles away in the kingdom of Astoria, Alara and Thomas were making their way through the bustling streets of Millhaven, a prosperous trading city that sat near the border between the two kingdoms. Here, among merchants and travelers from many different lands, 2 more refugees seeking a new start would attract little attention or curiosity. Thomas had contacts in the city, people who specialized in helping those who needed to disappear from their previous lives. For a price, they could provide new identities, safe passage to distant cities, and even letters of introduction to employers who asked few questions about their workers' backgrounds. The most important thing now, Thomas explained as they sat in a quiet tavern planning their next steps, is to give you time to decide what kind of life you want to build. We have enough resources to live modestly for several months while you learn practical skills and determine where your interests lie. Alara found the prospect both thrilling and terrifying. For the first time in her life, no one was telling her what she should do, what she should study, or how she should spend her days. The freedom to choose was intoxicating, but also overwhelming for someone who had never been allowed to make decisions about her own existence. I want to help people, she said after considerable thought. My mother always taught me that true nobility comes from service to others, not from titles or wealth. Perhaps I could work with the poor, or teach children to read, or help women who find themselves in difficult circumstances. Thomas smiled at her response, recognizing the echo of Queen Isabella's values in her daughter's words. There are many opportunities for such work in a city like this, and your education, even if you can't reveal its source, will make you valuable to schools, charitable organizations, and religious institutions. Over the following days, they established a new routine that felt strange but wonderful to Alara. She woke each morning in a simple but clean room at a respectable boarding house, dressed in practical clothes that allowed for actual work rather than ornamental display, and spent her time learning skills that would help her support herself independently. She discovered that she enjoyed working with her hands, whether helping in the kitchen of a local orphanage or assisting a seamstress who taught her practical sewing skills. The children at the orphanage delighted in her storytelling abilities, though they never suspected that her tales of princesses and kingdoms came from personal experience rather than imagination. Thomas proved to be an ideal companion for this new life, protective without being possessive, supportive without being condescending. He found work as a guard for one of the city's wealthy merchants, a position that provided steady income while allowing him to keep watch for any signs that Alara's father's agents had tracked them to Astoria. As weeks passed without any sign of pursuit, they began to relax into their new identities. Alara chose the name Elena for her new life, while Thomas became simply Tom, a young couple who had come to the city seeking better opportunities than their rural hometown could provide. But their peaceful interlude was shattered one morning when Tom burst into Elena's room at the boarding house with urgent news. "We need to leave immediately," he said as he began throwing their few possessions into travel bags. King Aldrich's agents arrived in the city yesterday. They're questioning tavern keepers and boarding house owners, showing a detailed description of Princess Alara. Elena felt her stomach drop as the reality of their situation crashed back over her. She had allowed herself to believe that her father might eventually give up the search, might accept that she was gone forever, and focus on other political arrangements. But King Aldrich was not a man who accepted defiance easily, especially when it threatened his relationships with powerful allies like Duke Roderick. "How long do we have?" she asked as she quickly gathered her belongings. "Not long." They were at the Silver Swan Tavern this morning, less than 2 blocks from here. The boarding house keeper is loyal, but if they offer enough gold, even honest people might be tempted to share information. They slipped out of the city before noon, once again traveling the country roads toward an uncertain destination. But this time, Elena felt less fear and more determination. She had tasted freedom now, had experienced the joy of making her own choices and living according to her own values. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would never again accept captivity willingly. "Where to now?" she asked as they put Millhaven behind them. "Further from the border," Tom replied. "There are cities deep in Astoria where your father's influence cannot reach, places where we can build a truly new life without constantly looking over our shoulders." As they rode toward the horizon, Elena reflected on how much she had changed in just a few short weeks. The frightened princess who had cowered before her father's rage was gone, replaced by a confident young woman who understood her own strength and worth. She had learned that happiness came not from wealth or status, but from freedom and purpose and the love of people who valued her for herself rather than her title. Behind them, in her father's kingdom, the search continued with decreasing intensity as other political crises demanded King Aldrich's attention. Duke Roderick had indeed withdrawn his alliance proposal, choosing instead to negotiate a marriage with a neighboring kingdom's princess who seemed more amenable to political arrangements. Captain Henrik and Marcus continued their service in the Royal Guard and stables respectively, their roles in the princess's escape never discovered or suspected. Sometimes, in quiet moments, they would exchange glances that held satisfaction for a job well done and hope that their former princess had found the happiness she deserved. And in the great cathedral where Princess Alara's wedding should have taken place, fresh flowers were placed each week by unknown hands on the altar where she should have spoken vows of obedience to a cruel husband. The flowers were white roses, and though no one could identify who brought them, everyone understood they represented something precious that had been saved from destruction. The princess was gone, but she was not lost. She was free, and that made all the difference in the world.